Hey everybody, welcome back to the Wisdom Nutrition Podcast. This is Alex Sakin. Today I have a interview with author Nick Cook, who wrote, in my opinion, one of the best books on the UFO topic, and that is The Hunt for Zero Point. And so in this interview, we're going to be doing a bit of a retrospective on the book. We're going to go through some of its main ideas. I'm going to present Nick with some of my own ideas that I've been developing over the course of the past, dozen or so episodes that I've done on the channel that have to do with the UFO issue, and particularly the human side of the equation. And Nick Cook does focus his book on the human side of the UFO story. In particular, he targets World War II and the Nazi program, and his book did a lot to reveal this Nazi program, this Nazi UFO program, and the idea that the American national security state, harvested this program after World War II. And so that forms a critical part of my analysis that I did in my long chapter, The Secret History of the 20th Century. And so in this episode, we're going to go over that material. I'm also going to discuss with him my ideas about the importance of the 19th century aspect of the UFO story and what it tells us about the sort of secret governance of America and the idea that a whole paradigm of science and technology has gone classified since around the early 1900s, around the time of Tesla. So anyway, these are all things we're going to be getting into in this episode. I really enjoyed this conversation with Nick. He's a great guy. And so without further ado, let's jump into it. This is me with Nick Cook. And once again, this is the Wisdom Nutrition Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. All right. Wonderful. I'm really glad to be talking with you. I want to just say that I think that you've written one of the most important books in the UFO field, ufology field. And it couldn't be more fitting for the current moment, I think, to be going back and talking about what you revealed in your book, Hunt for Zero Point. So what I'd like to do is go into some of the content, kind of go back in history and tell a side of the story of this sort of UFO issue that most people aren't aware of, which is this very human side of the equation. But I just want to get your reaction or ask you a couple questions that are kind of current for the moment. Now, I know you wrote your book about 20 something years ago.
Yeah,
Is this
scary.
Are you still keeping track of developments in the sort of aerospace national security state sort of field, or have you moved on? I know that you're writing novels now and you have a new project called Nick Cook Works, so I'd like to hear a little bit about that too. But I'm also wondering, are you keeping in track with what's going on in the world?
Well, I don't do the national security beat and the aerospace beat like I did, because I did that when I was at Jane's Defense Weekly. Right. So I sort of moved on from there. I'm fairly across the UFO issue. I'm pretty much across that. And the Nick Cook Works thing, that's just my website. I did some stuff back during lockdown, which was to do with sort of global challenges and engaging the aerospace industry in that.
Yeah,
I'm not doing that so much now, but I am pretty involved in the consciousness field. I am a research director of Robert Bigelow's Consciousness Institute.
Okay.
So if you're familiar with Robert Bigelow and all of his stuff in the world of ufology, yeah, I mean, you can just ask what I'm doing and I can tell you.
Yeah, well, I definitely like to get into the consciousness stuff a little bit later on. That's something I do a lot with my channel. The theme of, I don't know how much you were able to look at any of it, but my sort of focus is taking this field called esoteric philosophy, which is very much based in the ancient kind of wisdom traditions of the world, synthesizing them together, and then using that as a basis to analyze contemporary events and things that are going on in the world. And a big aim of mine was also to try to develop some type of model for how the overall social organism works in terms of like a sociological kind of approach to understand. So when we look at a current issue like the UFO situation, we can fall back on some backdrop of understanding about how the overall social mechanism works, how that would react to this kind of issue. And for me, your book is an important kind of clue to help us see what this sort of social model looks like, because part of it is having to do with the fact that there is a kind of technocracy or a sort of permanent bureaucracy that is in charge of weapons development and technology, very, very,
Sure.
profound research. And, this is not part of our democratic society. It's not really necessarily part of capitalism or the economic world. It's its own entity.
Sure. I'm pretty much across that. That's fine. And I'm much more interested in talking about that than I am in the sort of pure technology side.
Right.
So that interests me greatly. That's fine. And I have some views on it. So that's
Right.
good.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So let's go back in time then a bit and start looking at some of the content of your book. Now, I know the book starts with your kind of famous account of having worked at Jane's Defense Weekly and had this kind of unexpected envelope arrive at your doorstep, and that seemed like looking back on it, was that like a pivot point in your life, essentially, that moment of getting that journal and having your interest cued or piqued about this field, would you say?
Yeah, it definitely was. I mean, the whole triggering of that hunt that I did, the investigation that I did that went into the book, The Hunt for Zero Point, was a pivot point in my life. I mean, I didn't know it at the time. In fact, I didn't set out to write a book, of course. I was just setting out to do an investigation. So it's only when you look back on things, and this applies to us all, of course, things that don't make sense at the time very much, when you look back on them, they tend to fit into a pattern in your life that then begins to make sense of the journey that you've taken up to this point. And I can definitely look back to, that article landing on my desk and saying, that has helped to make my life make sense.
Right.
But at the time, of course, I had no idea that I would end up here where I am today,
Right.
or that I'd even end up writing that book, because it probably was another 6 or 7 years after that article landed on my desk. And of course, for those who aren't familiar with that article, it was an article from a 1950s magazine which talked about the heralding of a sort of anti-gravity age in the
Right.
mid 1950s.
Right.
And that, of course, that age never came. And looking back at it from my perspective then, which was in around 1990, the early 1990s, certainly, being an investigative journalist at the time, I thought, well, that's strange. You've got all of these companies talking about the golden age of anti-gravity that was going to come in the 1960s that never came. So let's take a look at that. And that's, of course, what triggered my investigation into it all.
It also seems that it was the mix of the article, along with what happened afterwards when you tried to reach out to one of the sources cited in the article. And it's the combination of and I find this is actually true of the UFO situation at all. It's never been only about the technology. It's also always been about the government's relationship to the technology. So for you had the article, and then you try to reach out to somebody who was in this aerospace world, who was cited in this 1950s article, who was still alive, and it was the idea that this person wasn't allowed to talk to you. Or
Yeah.
was that part? That's kind of the sense I got reading it.
Well,
It was that also that was like, okay, there's something here.
yeah, looking back on it, if that guy had only said, okay, I'll give you an interview, and then he could have said anything once you've given me the interview, I would have probably gone off and done something else. But instead, the reaction from the gatekeepers, if you like, and the gatekeepers at that time were public relations, a public relations individual within Lockheed Martin, which was the sort of inheritor company of Martin Aviation, Modern Aerospace, to which this individual had belonged back in the 1950s. If none of that had happened in the way that it did, again, I would have just gone, okay, well, there's nothing to see here,
Right.
and I would have marched off and done something else. But yeah, again, you look back and you think, well, on such tiny things, whole lives twist. My life again took a turn at that moment. I went on and I did that investigation. So yeah, isn't it strange how it all works out?
So what was the big break in the case for you early on, where you found that you had discovered something sort of new and worthwhile that brought you to the next step?
Well, I think the thing about the hunt for Zero Point, and it's interesting for me to look back on it too, because there was a whole period in my life after I wrote it, when I just didn't think about it at all. I just moved on to other things.
Right.
But I guess it's taken on a bit of a new life since the New York Times came up with its seminal UFO,
Right.
buried UFO investigation department in the Pentagon story in 2017. Right. And then I have looked back at it, and because people have asked me about it. But I think the thing about the Hunt for Zero Point is that there were no big revelations in it, really. I mean, it was just for me, it was a plodding investigation, such as I probably would have done on any major story that, I used to do when I was an editor at Jane's Defense Weekly. And my DNA that was sort of triggered by working for that magazine was all about investigation.
Right.
That's what we did. And so and we were taught to be quite, I was taught in my apprenticeship to be quite rigorous about what I turned over in terms of evidence. So I didn't really see any smoking gun. I mean, there was no real smoking gun in that book, but it just was a series, I think, of interlocking pieces of evidence, which,
Right.
when you pick the book up and you read it, you kind of go, yeah, I'd probably conclude, like Nick does, that there's something here.
Right.
And it has a sort of shape to it. But, I sort of leave it to the reader to judge whether there was a buried anti-gravity program there. And I've got my own views too about looking back on it, about that journey and about the conclusions that I reached then.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's just nice for me to know that the book still has a relevance today.
Yeah, I think it will continue to, particularly because of the aspects of it that are kind of timeless in terms of the analysis you did that aren't going to age, which has to do with the research in the Kammler style, which is the thing I want to go into. Hans Kammler, looking at Victor Schauberger, and kind of presenting this case where you can see clearly that behind the story of World War II and behind the Cold War, there is this hidden architecture being put into place. And I think that it's impossible to look at the current revelations, because the current revelations don't touch that. It's not about that part of it yet. It's just, we're at the stage where it's just an acknowledgement that this phenomenon exists. But the people who are coming out don't really seem to have a clue, and the people that are coming out, are not talking anything about this history. They're coming out with this idea of it must be aliens. It's the outer military isn't aware, isn't responsible for making these, therefore it must be aliens. It couldn't be this hidden world, but that hidden world is really the world that you kind of traversed to some degree, because you talk about going out and visiting some of these. I don't know if I can't remember if you were able to go inside, but at least knowing that there was these vast underground complexes out in the Midwest where these bases, who knows what they're working on, exist. But without reference to that infrastructure, how can you possibly analyze this issue, intelligently?
Well, so a few things come out of that. First of all, of course, when I look today at the UFO or UAP issue, for me, it's just not a binary. It's not a binary thing.
Hmm.
You know, it is clearly a repository of so many different issues. You know, so many different stories go into make up the UAP or UFO story. You know, from a technology story, there's unquestionably that in there, but it's also about us, you know, at the other end of the spectrum. It is a reflective phenomenon that reflects back at us what we bring to the mirror, if you like, what we bring to the screen, our, you know, perceptual reality screen,
Right.
and you know, and everything in between. But so all I was doing back in the 1990s when I decided to go on this journey, this investigative journey, was to look at a portion of the story that I felt that I could account for, which was the part that played to my training as an aerospace editor. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to kind of tick off, if you like, a sort of a part of the UFO phenomenon that could be accounted for by nuts and bolts technology. Because, you know, as we discussed earlier on, when I saw that article about the coming age of anti-gravity that never happened, I thought, okay, there are enough signatures here in what I know. And bear in mind, up to that point, you know, I'd looked at what let's paraphrase here as real world, black world aerospace technology like stealth. You know, and we covered those stories. So I thought, yeah, I'm getting the signatures of a buried program that's even more secret than stealth, that has to be about a truly momentous breakthrough. And the only one I could conceive of would have to be a propulsion breakthrough that would have to be that secret that it would hold for, well, up to that point in time, it was 3 or 4 decades. But it raises a whole lot of other things in your question, which is about the infrastructure that is required to keep a secret like that in place. And that infrastructure, I'd always felt, you know, even before I went off and investigated the facts behind the hump for 0 Point, I don't consider myself to be a particularly intuitive person, but whenever I walked into the Pentagon or, you know, a large aerospace and defense corporation, it gave me a feeling. And the feeling it gave me was there is collectively in this country, I am quarter American, by the way, so I like to think of myself as, when I go to America, I like to think of it partly as home. So when I go into these places, it gives me a feeling, and the feeling is that there are multiple layers beneath this institution which are covering up a secret. And the secret is not a technology secret per se. It is an institutionalized bureaucracy that is given over to the protection of secrets. And in a sense, all I did when I went on the journey in the hunt was to expose that infrastructure.
Yes.
And it is as much an infrastructure of the mind as it is one of true physical compartmentalized silos that hold the secrets. And then when we go on the journey in the hunt that takes us back to the Nazi stuff, the value of looking at that for me wasn't that in the end that there was a buried Nazi, you know, flying saucer program. You know, I go into it to look at it because in the sort of the lore around flying saucers, there was this part, as you know, that was all about, well, you know, the Nazis developed secret saucer tech. So I had to go off and look at that, very reluctantly, I might add. But the value of coming out of that part of the study, and the Kammler piece that you also referenced, was the realization that at the end of the Second World War, when the Allies go in and plunder German technological secrets, they take that back with them, and particularly America does. It takes back with it an infrastructure for handling secrets.
Yes.
And unfortunately, as I say in The Hunt for Zero Point, what it also does as an sort of witting byproduct of that is that there is a rub-off, unfortunately, of some of that ideology. I'm not saying that, America is riven with Nazi ideology. It is certainly not. But what it unwittingly took with it was, because it couldn't help but do that, when you bring that technology back, you bring a methodology back for holding on to secrets,
Right.
which was developed by Kammler and his staff. Unfortunately, what that also brings with it is a sort of virus.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, some of that virus is extant today, and it holds the secrets in place. And that's a truly unfortunate corollary of what happened back then.
Yeah. Yeah, you mentioned the psychological piece, and for me that's key, because if you look at psychology as having a collective aspect to it, when you have so there's this is what depth psychology, like Carl Jung, was based on, this idea that there's an individual psychology, but there's also this collective field, that there's no separation between the individual and the collective. And you find this in sociology too. You have this idea of institutions. So we're always, anytime you have a society, it's structured at this large level by institutions, and so it's impossible to understand the behavior of a person without understanding the institutional environment. So in both fields, you have this idea of individual and collective. So if we factor this in this idea of the collective psyche, when you have a situation of secrecy and compartmentalization, that means you have a psyche that's split and fractured within itself, and there isn't a coherent flow of energy between the various levels, because you have all these dams set up to block the flow. And so you have this, inevitably you have a widespread neurosis set in, because just as you do at the individual level, when you have all these blockages and things that are sort of repressed within yourself, secrets that you're keeping, your psyche starts to split. And I feel like that this explains a lot of the world we have today, is this, and so many years of secrecy, so many years of compartmentalization have taken their toll, to the point that we have where we are in today, like a real world emergency and a psychological emergency.
I couldn't agree more with that. Yeah, and it is a truly unfortunate side effect of all of this, that there is a fragmentation. I mean, I hadn't really truly thought of it in those terms, but I think that it's so analogous, what you say, to the collective unconscious posited by Carl Jung, and where you've got this tremendous infrastructure, which you do in America, that is given over to secrecy, and the corrosive effect that has, because what it does is, you can't, I don't think, separate it from the democratic processes of government that lie on its surface. That's the surface layer.
Right.
But underneath it, there is this very corrosive, compartmentalized system that was given over to begin with to govern technology, technological secrets.
Right.
But of course, sadly, it couldn't be contained in that way. And I think that there has been seepage over many decades that has come to the surface,
Right.
and of course has corroded the upper levels, and those levels are the democratic processes that we see in government. But below it, I think, as I say in the book, the system of government is compartmentalized to death, vertically and horizontally, so that this is the unfortunate result of where we are. And what interests me, today, when I look at some of the events on Capitol Hill where, as a bipartisan issue, both sides of the House are looking at the UFO UAP issue. And again, what, perhaps what they thought they were getting into was, where are the flying saucers buried? Where are the alien bodies buried?
Right.
Well, actually, what they are now uncovering is this system that we're talking about, which is one that has been in place for decades and is, given over to, or rather not giving over to, giving up its secrets, and doesn't like it when it's being kicked in this way. And it's going to be very reluctant to give those secrets up. And, it's a challenging task. But, nothing in the end stays buried forever. And it's almost like this stuff is ready to be given up.
Right.
So it's fascinating, as a sort of casual observer of these things, to see how it is unfolding.
So I would like to maybe come back to some of these points at the very end, but now I want to go and maybe try to put a bit of a historical sort of timeline to things. So when we're thinking about all the topics we're talking about, technology, secrecy, compartmentalization, in America, where do you point to for the beginning of this movement, or the beginning of events that culminated in the establishment of this sort of governmental compartmentalized structure?
Well, it's hard to say, but I don't think it was truly in place on a widespread basis before, certainly not before the Second World War or America's entry into the Second World War. There was, of course, the Manhattan Program, which produced the atomic bomb, which was its own version of compartmentalization and secrecy. But as I say in the book, it didn't work very well. That version of it, if anyone who's just watched Oppenheimer will know that the secret of the Manhattan Project didn't hold for very long. But before the Manhattan Project, there was really nothing that held, secrecy on a widespread basis in place. Then I think you had the Manhattan Project, which sort of set a precedent for it. But it wasn't until, as I said earlier, that the German system was imported back into the States, particularly. I mean, Britain's not blameless in this either. But predominantly it was the US, because of that recruitment of Nazi science and tech, which was, I think, affected most. And it was tempting to bring it back, because the system put in place by Hans Kammler, who was Germany's head of, at least he was obviously the SS plenipotentiary put in place by Hitler to safeguard and nurture Germany's most advanced technology at the end of the Second World War.
Yeah.
So it was very tempting to bring that stuff back. I don't think anyone knew that it was going to come back infected by this kind of virus, but of course it did. And the German system was incredibly effective. I mean, the system put in place by Kammler was phenomenally effective. And it's kind of interesting too that Kammler sort of instituted an underground system. I mean, literally a physical underground system.
And you've seen some of that, right? You've seen some of that infrastructure.
I mean, I did. I mean, I traveled quite a bit and was shown parts of it, and there's much of it, you can't see because it has literally been blown up.
Right.
But the bits that you can see are testament to its effectiveness. And, without wishing to get too overly psychological about all of this, it's when you take things underground, you literally make things very, very dark. Right. And what you had, of course, during the Cold War in America was the need to take things underground because nuclear weapons and the threat of Armageddon require you to put things underground to protect them. But of course, in a way, what you're beginning to mirror is that terrible, horrible sort of troglodyte world that Kammler put in place at the end of the Second World War with the German system. So again, you get that sort of mirror image from Germany into the States. And, that is, it is too, it's very beguiling and infecting. And I just, you raised this point earlier about how when everything becomes compartmentalized and fractured, of course, it destroys creativity in a way. If my brain were to become fragmented in the way that the system has become fragmented, I wouldn't be very creative. No one would be. And one of the accusations today leveled at the UAP world is that if we have taken sequestered non-human technology and put it into that system, and if, as we hear, I don't know how true this is, but it's certainly something you hear, that science, the black world science, has not made very much progress with sequestered non-human technology because it is so compartmentalized. Well, I'm not surprised, because if you're going to make sense of something that has crashed to this world that is non-human, you're going to need to bring all of science to it, black world and white world, in order to make sense of it. But clearly that's not happening. So that's, I'm just not surprised at all by that, because of the way science works. You've got to, science to be effective, you have to open it up.
Right.
And that clearly is not happening, or has not been happening over the past several decades in that world.
You brought up a good point. It does, this whole issue, literally the underground aspect of it is like a perfect symbolic representation of the shadow, what Jung would call the shadow, or a shadow complex. So these idea of the things that you repress within yourself have a way of manifesting in your life, either externally or through your own like neurotic tendencies. And so the need to keep secrets is one of these primary things that cause a shadow complex. And collectively, the literal secret science, technology, underground, and all the consequences of that is very much a literal version of the formation of a vast collective shadow complex.
Indeed, it has created a shadow world, a shadow complex, and you could say a shadow government. So, none of which is, in psyche terms, if you take the collective psyche of a nation, or for that matter, even for the world, is a very good thing.
Right.
So, I look forward to the time when this is broken down, because it is not good for us as us as a planet to operate on that basis. I understand why it happened. When you move from a devastating global conflict like the Second World War into then a Cold War, which threatens even greater destruction, you are going to be very protective of your nation state and your infrastructure, and as far as you can, your way of life. Taking that underground, literally and metaphorically, was, to those, the planners behind that sort of safety structure, was what they thought they were doing best for them. And it worked in national security terms, but it has no place anymore. It shouldn't do, because it ultimately becomes corrosive. Right. And I think that's what's happened.
Yeah. There's a couple mysteries about this situation that I want to present, maybe just get your take on that kind of precede the events that you pick up on in the book that have to do with World War II. These are some mysteries that have to do with things that happened in the 1900s. An obvious one, I'll go into a couple others, but an obvious one is the story of Nikola Tesla. This is in the late 1800s, 1890s, early 1900s. So before Victor Schauberger, before whatever exists in the modern Martin Aircraft Agency or whatever, some of the ideas of whatever science is behind these breakthrough technologies that is being sequestered in this Black Projects world, it seems that those scientific ideas were being worked with and discovered by this sort of savant Nikola Tesla. And so let's start kind of our investigation there. What did you uncover about him and his work and his ideas over the course of researching your book, and where do you think that he fits into the story?
Well, actually, Tesla hardly features at all in the Hunt for Zero Point, and I'm not even sure. I mean, I think I probably made the odd reference to him, and I deliberately didn't go into the world of Tesla because he'd been covered so extensively by other people. I just felt I could make no meaningful contribution where others had gone before me. Of course, I've read up on Tesla since, but I'm not an expert, and so I can't really comment on in any great depth on
Right.
the Tesla story. Beyond the fact that he clearly was a genius. He's laid the foundations of the modern electronics industry, the modern electrical industry. The man was a genius. He clearly had ideas way ahead of his time. There is some suspicion, as far as I can see, about events around his death and how those ideas, or some of his ideas, seem to have sort of been grabbed and buried and put away. That, to be at the time, and it still does all feel a bit conspiratorial for me. I mean, in terms of, it sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory, and I'm not an expert enough on him to know whether any of that is true.
Right.
So I'm going to sort of plead the fifth on that one and just go, that's about as much as my knowledge of, as far as my knowledge of Tesla will take.
Well, all right. So there's a couple points I want to mention about him that I think are important. I think when we look at him, we have to particularly what happened, where he had this career that was going ascending, and then all of a sudden it just stops, and essentially all his funding, everything stops, and in particular, that shift, that change has to do with this relationship with J.P. Morgan. I don't know if this is an aspect that you went into, but J.P. Morgan was one of his financiers. And he was working on a project out in Long Island off of New York, and was financed by JP Morgan. And he kind of, so this is what happened. Tesla sold the idea to JP Morgan that he was going to create a communication device using the atmosphere. Kind of an early type of wireless communication, telephones. But actually secretly he was working to build the infrastructure for energy, he wanted to test his idea for free energy, not an energy system not based on wires, like the Edison kind of model. And JP Morgan was also involved with Edison. And so when JP Morgan eventually learned of what Tesla's actual purpose was, how he was trying to essentially create something that would revolutionize the economy and society, then that's when the first indication of a type of conspiracy to sequester those blueprints and technologies. But also, I think around this time is when you first find a concerted movement to start dividing the science, dividing the physics, where there was a sort of creation of a public physics, a kind of public mythology, we can think about it, of Einstein, relativity, space-time, things like that have never fit together into a meaningful picture. We have just all these isolated schools of thinking in physics now. But that really division happened then because the ideas that Tesla was working with, and this is what he states transparently in his book. He was going back into kind of the ancient philosophical ideas of alchemy to some degree. He was talking about the ether, the idea of a luminiferous ether, the idea of space time not being this empty kind of void, but rather space itself is actually a field of energy that forms draw into themselves, that living forms, life forms draw into themselves. And so there's this relationship between metaphysics and physics. And so this idea of metaphysics, physics, the ether, that begins to disappear right around 1900, the right 1900s, 1910s, 1920s. And instead you see this promotion of this sort of Einstein kind of physics. And this was the very physics that as we'll be discussing later on, the Germans had discarded, and they were working with the ether concept in their technologies. They were also very occult kind of inspired, looking back to influences in alchemy. The Kammler Stab was in that whole milieu of the SS. And so it seems that some mysterious thing happened in America where I think the beginning of an entity, the beginning of a perspective and a group and a power interest had this threat of Tesla face them, and it's inspired a type of organization to happen and a type of mission to be formed to how do we control, monopolize, and figure out what to do with this technology, and how do we set about a mission to create a social order that you can one day use these technologies. And to me, that explains another thing that happens right around this time is you start to see the beginning of an imperial mindset in America, where America starts to make these moves throughout World War I, the interwar period, World War II, where gradually there's this coalition of interests to replace the British Empire and to install an American imperium, American economic imperium. And so all these critical things happen right around the year 1900. And so for me, that's where the story really begins.
Well, you're probably right. The more I have looked into, issues around consciousness, which is, I've been spending some time doing over the past 5 or 10 years, the more it is readily apparent to me, at least, that, the world that we inhabit is largely illusory. The physical makeup of the world is largely illusory. I mean, in the sense that what we take as a hard physical material universe is merely the surface froth of a much deeper reality.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't, I don't think, differentiate or distinguish between physics and metaphysics, because they are integrally bound up and bound together. So you get someone like Tesla, who was clearly, to me at least, from the little I know about him, someone who was quite ethereal in his makeup, in his the way he impacted the world. There was an otherworldly quality to him, but that otherworldly quality is what gave him his genius, I think. Right. But it also allowed him to see some of the mechanics, if you can call it that, of the deeper world. But then coming the other direction, you have hard, materialists like J.P. Morgan and Edison, who were sculpting a very different kind of world. And it's almost as if there was no room in it for Tesla, right. Or maybe the world wasn't ready for Tesla or someone like him at that time. It's almost like, at the beginning of this, I was talking about how you look back over your life and your life makes sense now, but bits of it don't make any sense at all while you're going through right. certain moments. And it's sort of like that a bit when you look back over the 20th century. You right. sort of think, well, it's almost like we had to go through all of those machinations to get to where we are now. Right. Maybe for our own psychological psychic development
Yes.
as a species. And what Tesla was offering was a sort of short-circuiting of the system to advance us quicker than we were ready to be advanced. And it's sort of, I'm getting way ahead of myself here, but it's almost like because the world wasn't ready for that,
Yes.
it sort of destroyed him. I mean, it destroyed him. Of course, he lived to a fairly ripe old age, but that's how it seems to me. There are certain people that the world is not yet ready for, and it's almost like something contrives to ease them out of the system, to make way for things that we have to go through, to advance our consciousness, perhaps to where it's then supposed to be. And I can't, because I'm not a Tesla expert, I couldn't really go into it in any more depth than that. But that's sort of how I feel about it. In a
I agree
way.
with your point that there's a bit of a feeling of fate and destiny to it all. And like you were saying, at any given time in human history, the people who are living through it, through what they're going through, it seems like chaos. But now when we look back at the story of history, you clearly see these episodes and this developmental arch that's taking place. And my feeling is that what we're going through today seems very chaotic at the moment, but with retrospect, 100 years from now, it'll be clear kind of what the destiny that's fulfilling itself during this moment. Because like you were saying, there seems to be stages that mankind has to go through, and we have to really go through something and learn from experience before we can achieve another a higher stage or a next level of life.
A sort of consciousness leap.
And there's lots of traces of this kind of thinking in ancient philosophy, particularly in the study of astrology, because there's this idea of time cycles that have these thematic elements that will play out. So like different astrological ages, like the Great Platonic Year and the Wheel of the Zodiac, that during the age of Pisces, a certain archetypal experience is going to express itself through. And so now, this is what I wrote about in my last article. We're in this kind of transition point where the Pisces is ending, Aquarian themes and stuff are beginning to come through, and very much these ideas about the ether and the technology that these kind of breakthrough devices like UFOs are using have to do with the thematic elements of Aquarius that we're moving into. But then Pisces has this idea of somewhat of like a splitting. And so this kind of bears in, I think, into what you were saying, is that there are these archetypal themes that mankind has to experience. And I agree with you that Tesla was sort of living a somewhat ill-fated life, where he was this pioneer who was going to bring something out that was going to have effect on the world, but it wasn't in the way that he thought it was. I feel like he definitely wasn't the only one, but he helped inspire this sort of reaction against against these scientific ideas, against this technology, and this need to conceal and protect and everything that would become institutionalized within this military industrial complex that we have today. So in some ways, I feel like he was born to inspire that shift. And so he has his life does have a bit of a feeling of fate and synchronicity kind of all the way through it. There's one more thing I want to point out about the 1800s aspect of this story. I don't know if this is something that you came across in your research, but there was this famous wave of sightings of what was at the time called flying airships. This is in the 1890s. There were hundreds of newspaper articles about them. It was relatively common. And then right around 1900, right around this period, they suddenly cease, which again might suggest that we're seeing a time of consolidation on some secret level of U.S. society, U.S. power elite involving this technology. But in the research I found back then, when they're talking about these sort of more crude flying airships, which are using anti-gravity principles, but they don't look like UFOs. They look like kind of steampunk-esque ships to various degrees. It's number one, it's extremely clear that these are run by humans. There's no alien. The alien concept doesn't really come until after World War II, after the harvesting of the German program by America. And so we'll get into that. But it also there was a reference to sort of the idea at this early stage. It was secret societies, it was esoteric orders that were really trying to experiment with rediscovering some of the principles of alchemy, but now applying it in this move into the industrial age, applying it in a technological industrial concept. And they were experimenting with developing, yeah, technologies, devices of various types that were using these ideas of ancient alchemy. And this idea of the ether once again comes up because this is one of the foundational principles of alchemy. And you keep running to this idea of ether over and over again in this world of UFO research, breakthrough energy research, Tesla research. So for me, there is this mystery in America that dates back before the Germans, before the harvesting of the German program, that there was something here in America already working with these ideas, already set about sort of monopolizing it. And then as we go into the early 1900s, but particularly the World War I and the interwar period, we find this move in American corporations, American banks to establish these deep-rooted connections in Germany and in Russia, even with the idea of creating a world cartel system, an energy cartel. And so when we look at the German program, which is what I want to move into in a moment, and how the Kammler program worked, the secret underground research facilities, that there was a heavy presence of these corporations, IG Farben and other types, and those German corporations had extensive ties with these American networks of financiers and capitalists. So in some way, the German program never existed or emerged fully independently of involvement and oversight and somewhat, to some degree, protection from some hidden unknown thing that was being developed in America in the very early 1900s, that had this view of secret science, that is attempting to write either physics off the books, that is probably responsible for shutting down these airship mysteries, because there were like hundreds of articles about these flying airships in 1896 1897, and then it just stops. And so for me, that's where the story really begins, but there's so little information about what this is and how it works, that it's really the story that you tell in The Hunt for Zero Point that we can start getting really detailed understanding about how this system would develop over time going into the rest of the 20th century. So this earlier phase, we can see hints and clues, but it's really not until after World War II that anything really real, that we can now track what the modern situation looks like. I know it was kind of a long explanation, but those are, for me, like some of the most important aspects of the UFO mystery that are never discussed anywhere, almost. This idea of the human basis in the 1900s and this idea of ether and alchemy. So anyway, any comments on that before we move on?
Yeah, well, sort of. I mean, so I'm aware of that airship wave of the late 19th century in America, and again, I'm not done an in-depth study of it, but for me, well, let me backtrack a second. So when 30 years ago, almost, when I started investigating the Hunt for Zero Point, I was looking for tangible, physical evidence, nuts and bolts stuff.
Right.
Because that's what the tradition I'd grown up in. I mean, career-wise. I did the book, left it behind, moved on, have moved into other areas. When I look back again, the world seems to me a lot less solid than it did when I started out investigating the Hunt for Zero Point in the 1990s. So when I look at a phenomenon like the American airship mystery of the late 19th century, I see it through a very different lens than I would have seen it then. Mm-hmm. The lens I see it through now is more metaphysical. It is, did this really happen? Were there really airships that were flying across Texas and, the Midwest or wherever, with people leaning out saying absurd things to people on the ground, well, I have a really hard time believing that,
Right.
that it was a solid physical phenomenon. And, of course, Jacques Vallée and others have done, to my mind, good work in trying to elucidate the sort of the very fluid nature of phenomena that appear like that appear to be quite reflective of the era that they arise in. Jacques takes that right back to medieval times and lore about goblins and fairies and mythology around that, being reflective of the age that they appeared in then. So when I look at a phenomenon like that, I have to see it in that context, that it was somehow reflective of the age that it appeared in.
Mm-hmm.
A little like, the UFO phenomenon as it arose in the 1940s and 47 onwards,
Mm-hmm.
was sort of reflective of, things that were happening in America and elsewhere then. I also note that the UFO phenomenon, as it sort of exists today, is quite, or it appears to be quite chameleon-like in the way that it camouflages itself.
Mm-hmm.
So if there is a non-human intelligence dimension to the UFO phenomenon, and I think on evidence there is, then it is pretty good at disguising itself. And therefore, it may mimic things that, it believes that people are ready to see in the skies and elsewhere at the time. So there may be a mimicry component to what is seen by people in the age that they view strange phenomena in. I haven't really taken it much further than that, except again, and I think it comes back to this notion that, hard reality is not hard reality at all. It's actually incredibly fluid. And, if we were to take this discussion back a step too, to what you were talking about a moment ago, about why it is that certain breakthroughs don't happen kind of when they seem they should. So we were talking about Tesla, but we could also talk about zero-point energy. I take the title of the book from pioneers in the zero-point energy field who were and are trying to bring about a breakthrough in producing energy from the vacuum, the quantum vacuum. There are instances of, I think, of many inventors, a bit like Tesla, who kind of nearly achieved that breakthrough, but were either crushed by the establishment into not bringing that technology through. I mean, Schauberger is another one. I'm sure we can talk about him shortly.
Yeah.
But it
You
never
talked about
happened.
Hutchinson, right? Didn't you interview Hutchinson in your book?
I
John
did.
Hutchinson?
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, John's kind of another one too, but there are multiple others. It never quite happens.
Mm-hmm.
I've mentioned Jacques Vallée a moment ago, who posits a theory called the control system theory, that intelligences or an intelligence, an overarching intelligence, is sort of manipulating our reality. And you could posit from that intelligence, if it exists, if we live in this kind of simulated world, is saying, that the human program that we're running now isn't ready, or we don't want it to be ready to absorb that technology yet. The present state that it's in has some time to run before we or it, humanity, is ready for that technology.
Right.
And zero-point energy may be an example of that. As with anything, it can be creative or destructive. And, we in our present state, and depressingly, as we see, conflict and standoff, resurrecting itself in the world, you can very clearly make a case to say that humanity is not ready yet for another technology or another science that could either be extremely positive for the world or very destructive. Because sure as eggs is eggs, humanity in its present state is going to look to see how it can make a bomb out of 0-point energy as quickly as,
Right.
or maybe even before, it's going to turn it to positive use.
Right.
So, all of that by way of saying things that appear may not be as they seem. And I think that airship wave of the late 19th century, for me, is something that need not necessarily be seen through a pure nuts and bolts prism or in a nuts and bolts capacity,
Right.
because it just has this very surreal quality about it, which says to me, someone or something is shaping reality to give it a twist that it's not just about nuts and bolts.
Right. Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying, and in fact, you're almost describing in different words my ultimate perspective on it. All right, so one thing I want to say, when I keep saying the word either, it's like equivalent to 0-point. It's the same kind of idea, and but the either concept is important because we can trace this back thousands of years into this sort of field that in esoteric philosophy that this is what you study, the idea of that there has always been a sort of like high priesthood, a council of elders, who have maintained this tradition of understanding the sort of secrets of consciousness, mind, energy, and this is where you get the reports of, in India, there's always been legends about sort of great called adepts or arhats or gurus or sages, and actually all cultures and traditions have their version of this. And in sort of classical times, like ancient Greece, for example, that knowledge existed, but it was always held and protected within the body of this institution, this great hidden institution that I think exists today, has always existed, but it's very much out of our awareness, which is the idea of it goes by different names, but it's called the mystery schools, or was once called the mystery schools. And for me, that's the thing that kind of changed my thinking on the whole thing was learning this UFO issue, was learning about its interface with this idea of either and alchemy, because those fields have always been under the protective umbrella of the mystery schools. And that tells me that ultimately this technology is not, and the trajectory of world events is not controlled by any sort of group that we would normally think about, like a deep state or something like that. That ultimately the whole thing is orchestrated at this level of the mystery schools, and their approach to life and the way that they were involved with government in all times was through initiation. That they would set up these mystery plays, and they would sort of force mankind to go through an experience, either individually, the candidate going through the mystery schools grades of disciple would be presented with these experiences that they would have to be faced with and overcome before they get to the next level. And looking at a kind of microcosm, macrocosm view, I think that today, in this modern age, this whole mystery about UFOs and secret government and all that stuff is ultimately part of an initiation, initiation ritual being carried out by this mystery school institution. And I would say something that a lot of people are want to overlook: the symbols of this mystery school are on the dollar bill. The traditional symbols of the all-seeing eye with the pyramid and the eagle, which is really a phoenix, those are the traditional symbols of the mystery school. So for me, this idea that Jacques Vallée is talking about, this overseeing intelligence, is interfacing with this, not with extraterrestrial intelligence or something from somewhere else, but it has to do with the mysteries of life on Earth, and this idea that there is a God and an over intelligence and over soul, and also an institution within human life that interfaces with these mysteries and is responsible for evolving the collective psyche, the collective body of man, from stage to stage in this longer developmental developmental sequence. So that's my ultimate perspective.
I mean, the piece that I just can't fit into that puzzle that you describe is the human dimension, that there is a hidden body of humanity, a sort of, you know, the mystery schools or whatever body that is interfacing with the higher power and shaping the reality itself. I mean, it may be. I've always said, if you're going to get involved in this field, you need to reserve the right to change your mind at any time. Right. So I just don't know enough about it, is what I'm saying. What I can subscribe to is a version of reality that is so fluid that it can break through our physical, you know, material, reductionist view of the world in places, you know, quite successfully, and what that results in are the appearance of absurdities, you know, to our mind when we look at them through a sort of material eye. But, you know, that may be, I don't know, maybe it is shaped by some higher power, maybe it's shaped by some lower intelligence, or maybe a combination of them. But all I do know is the solid physical reality that we think of as our real world is not as solid and physical, right, and real as it appears to be. Right. And, you know, we have that is the way it presents itself to us.
Right. Okay, so let's go into a bit now on the sort of organizational dynamics of Nazi Germany, the SS, and the Kammler program, because I feel like this is going to tell us, like you were saying and hinted before, there's a clear relationship between this program in Germany and the post-war American national security state military industrial complex. There was a harvesting that happened, more or less. And so by learning something about this German program, we can gain certain insights into America, the current American situation. So describing what happened in Nazi Germany that led up to the build out of their secret weapons sort of empire, how would you start that story, or what would you say were the things that came about to bring about this unique situation in Nazi Germany during the war, where they had this completely secret technology world that still to this day almost nobody knows about?
Well, it was startling to me when I found out about it, because I think, as I say in the Humphreys Zero Point, you know, I certainly knew a lot about technology because that was my job. I was a technology editor for a defense journal. I thought, on an interest level, I knew quite a lot about World War II because I've always been interested in modern history. But when I found out about the Kammler Stab, the secret office set up and run by General Hans Kammler, who was an SS high-ranking SS general,
an engineer, basically, right?
Well, he was an administrator, is what he was. He was more an administrator than an engineer, and that's why he was put in place of this organization, was because he had extraordinarily effective administrative skills. You know, along with those extraordinarily effective administrative skills came a propensity, as you'd expect from someone in the SS hierarchy, for extreme violence, which of course made him a very sought after figure at the end of the war, not just because of his knowledge about German secret weaponry, but because he was a key figure in the Holocaust.
Right. Because he designed the early concentration. I mean, like It seems like his specialty was he started off designing the concentration camps, and then he kind of quickly moved over into interfacing the concentration camps with these secret weapons programs, because the concentration camps were being actually mined as slave labor essentially for these camps, right?
Correct. So what he did was effectively build up an empire within an empire. So
Right.
the SS was an institution within the greater German hierarchy, Nazi hierarchy.
Right.
But within the SS itself, Kammler had built what I call in the book a kind of kingdom of technology. It was a technology kingdom.
Right.
As we said before, much of it was put underground to protect it from discovery and bombing by the Allies. And the manpower for building, well, first of all, actually excavating those underground bunkers and caves and factories where all of this stuff, was made, was done by slave labor from the concentration camps. But then, of course, the technology itself, the factory production lines, were also manned by slave labor. So the whole thing had a very deeply unpleasant sort of DNA running throughout it. I mean, it was born out of suffering, but it was extensive. This kingdom stretched from southern Poland into parts of Germany, East Germany, then into Austria and the Czech Republic,
Right.
Czechoslovakia as it then was. And I visited quite a few outposts of this kingdom, as we mentioned earlier, and there is a sort of horrible feeling of sort of oppression about it, but it was extremely effective and widespread and very tightly run, and very little was known about it. So perhaps I shouldn't be as surprised as I was that I didn't know much about it, because even when I was looking at it in the early to mid 1990s, very little was known about it. I came across a reference to it in a pretty obscure book, and I'd never heard of Kammler before, and I should have, because of the extraordinary impact that he had on the world of technology at the end of the Second World War. But, as you'll know from having read the book, part of that, his anonymity was deliberately orchestrated, because he was literally made to disappear at the end of the war.
Right.
There were multiple versions of his death, given to the public record, which made people believe that he had, died at the end of the Second World War. We now know that not to be the case. He was he surrendered to American troops, forces at the end of the Second World War, and was alive for at least a year and interrogated for a year after the end of the Second World War. The fact that has been kept secret can in large part be attributed to the fact that he was so instrumental in the machinery of the Holocaust. And that was all covered up. So yeah, it's all mired in a tremendous amount of secrecy.
Right. Looking at the strategy they used to compartmentalize and conceal what they were doing, they used a kind of various levels where the bottom levels would sort of bottom level projects would sort of exist to obfuscate the fact that there were deeper levels. And I think I remember you writing about how in these underground bases there would be levels of tunnels or levels of project that literally embodied this idea, where the deeper like if you're working on the top level stuff, you might be working on V2 rockets, and at the bottom level stuff you could be working on who knows what, like something really exotic perhaps. But the top level stuff, even within a secret, that underground thing, there was secrets within secrets. So you have these sort of false leads kind of put out about what kind of secret projects were being worked on. But so stuff was very buried, right? Would you say, like, describing how their organizational projects dynamic worked?
Well, as we've discussed, it was physically buried, or a lot of it was physically buried. I didn't come across any evidence, as far as I recall, and this is going a long way back now, but I don't recall evidence that the more secret a project, the physically, the deeper it would be.
Right.
That may be so, and you may have uncovered that through other people. For my part, the secrecy was more about an institutional kind of secrecy. So, somebody working on a part of the V2 maybe is a bad example, but somebody working on, a part of a secret weapon, whatever that was, would not have knowledge of another part of that secret weapon, right, that might have been associated with a different part of the overall system. That same methodology, by the way, has been used in the production of black world technology in America and elsewhere today, or in the intervening period. So they
pioneered that. They pioneered that approach. Would you say they were the pioneers of that approach?
Unquestionably, the Germans, and in particular Kammler's staff, were the progenitors of that system, for sure. Yeah. And also all the counterintelligence that went in place around it. So not only was the system itself extremely secret, with different components for machinery being built in siloed compartments and offices and machine shops or whatever, but there was a counterintelligence organization around the whole organization that was designed specifically to mislead people about what was going on in those factories or underground facilities.
Yeah. As my reading, and very heavily inspired by your book, that that one of the main things that was imported from Germany was this infrastructure, not just about the physical technologies, but this infrastructure for having secret projects, for having concealed, underground, compartmentalized projects with this security architecture over them that's deliberately trying to mislead and conceal. Because, like you were saying, all of that stuff after the war all of a sudden pops up in America in this way that it's deeply institutionalized within the national security state. Almost from 1945 on, you see a move to embrace this culture, and then you have these events like Roswell and other things that seem to exist in order to further the justification for enhancing this system that's being put up, enhancing this sort of culture of secrecy and compartmentalization and stuff like that. So that's one of the most important things I think about your book, is that you break this the Kammlerstab story, and the Kammlerstab is the thing that we have to understand America, because this program was literally brought and harvested into America and basically replicated 1,000-fold, or brought to an extreme, a whole nother level. But the core features that you discuss when you talk about the Kammlerstab, you can see them all present once again in the American military industrial complex, including literally the underground bases, but also this idea of having this sort of security architecture that's
well, I think it was pretty obvious to the Allies, the Brits and the Americans at the end of the Second World War, that so much of this machinery that the Germans and the SS had built, particularly around secret weapons, so much of that was unknown to them at the end of the Second World War. Literally, there were instances where Allied troops would advance over German underground facilities and they would not know that they were there. And it was only sometime afterwards, when these when the front line had advanced, and literally workers and individuals would appear, I think, after the German surrender, going, hey, we've been beneath your feet all of this time, literally. That they realized how extensive these facilities were, a lot of them. That led them unquestionably to think, this was a very effective system. And as I've said earlier, the import of that system would have then been very tempting. I mean, it was not only tempting, they did it because they could see how effectively it had worked for Germany. And the unfortunate byproduct of it, as I've said also, was that a lot of that, the more unfortunate aspects of secrecy, the kind of corrosive aspects of it came too. But there was a deliberate methodology, I think, in importing the literal physical architecture of the system across. And I mean, the part that I did not know at the end of the book, Hunt for Zero Point, was what had happened to Kammler. I did not know then what I know now, what has been uncovered by others, that Kammler didn't die at the end of the Second World War. He handed himself over to the Americans. He was debriefed extensively. And then something happened to him. Don't know what happened, but it said he escaped from custody in an interrogation facility in Germany about 10 months after the end of the war. And then thereafter that, the trail goes cold again. But you can bet your bottom dollar in those intervening 10 months, the guy would have been bled dry for what he knew about the system he created, which was this system of compartmentalization for highly secret technology. And you can see that then transposed into the American post-Second World War, Cold War defense architecture, which again has been tremendously effective. And it had to be, because it was, as we discussed earlier, designed to withstand Armageddon in the event of a thermonuclear exchange.
So besides breaking the story in the Kammler Stop program, you also kind of break this idea of that there was a whole portfolio of projects that were pursuing of all different types. And some of them got really exotic and actually had to do with this mystery of the UFO, because we have this idea of Victor Schauberger, and then we also have this idea of the bell, the Nazi bell. And so, it's interesting to draw an analogy between this German program and then the current program, because in the current situation, you would have a current military industrial complex in America. You have these different layers of black projects. So on one level, you could have like the stealth bomber, and that's based on one kind of paradigm of engineering and science and technology. But then you also have a level that's unseen that could be having to do with anti-gravity and making UFOs that we're seeing in the sky. And so there's these different levels. And so, going back to Nazi Germany, the first thing that people point to when they talk about, there was a secret technology program in Germany, they would say, they were trying to develop the V2 bombs, maybe advanced fighter jets and stuff like that. But they don't touch on these really deep exotic levels of research but these were the most highly prioritized and highly prized, it seems, of the Kammler Stop program. Like the Bell, I think you mentioned that it was called the Wonder Weapon and was their most highly prized, and maybe Victor Schauberger's research interfaced with that to some degree. But what can you tell us about this sort of tiered level of secret programs with truly exotic technologies existing at the very deepest shadowy levels?
So I tried to be very careful in the writing of the book about what was known and what was sort of conjecture.
Right.
So, in your description of, different sort of levels of secrecy around, secret weapons projects, starting with things like the V1 and the V2, which were guided weapons, into more exotic stuff. First of all, I should say that the story around the bell was not discovered by me. It was actually uncovered by a guy called Igor Witkowski, who had developed his own theories about what that was, which sort of differentiated somewhat from my own at the end of the book. I was very happy to listen to Igor expound his theories about what the bell was. He saw it as a sort of proto anti-gravity device that somehow, spun up all kinds of sort of, fields which gave it a sort of anti-gravitational property. I couldn't, with any certainty, say that that was true. That just the evidence wasn't there for me.
Right.
What was patently true was that the bell had been sequestered, hidden away in a very mysterious SS weapons complex in modern southern Poland, and that complex you could see even from the evidence, the topological evidence, the evidence of infrastructure still in place, was that this was a very secret facility given over to very secret stuff. I personally believe today that the infrastructure that was set up there was to do with an SS-run nuclear weapons program more than it was about anti-gravity. It could be, maybe Igor is right, and maybe that the bell is or was an anti-gravity device. I couldn't say that with certainty myself. I would hazard that it was probably to do with some kind of isotope separation device to do with a nuclear program before I could say it was anything to do with an anti-gravity program. But I have to hold my hands up and go, maybe it was.
Right.
Schauberger, again, interesting in that here was a guy who had developed very unique theories about how machinery worked under sort of very natural laws and processes. And he was unquestionably, because I saw the documentary evidence, much of it presented to me by Victor Schauberger's family when I went to visit them, that Schauberger was suborned by the SS to go off and do certain secret stuff. By his own testimony, Schauberger's own testimony, he was developing engines for things that certainly looked pretty exotic. He testified in his own diaries and accounts that some of this stuff flew, I guess, we might be tempted to say anti-gravitationally, but certainly in a way that was, not conventional, put it that way. You could also make a case, though, I think, when you look at it retrospectively, and in a sort of slightly revisionist way, which I'm now able to do because it's 25 years on from when I was really looking at that stuff, that Schauberger too could have been suborned into this highly secret SS-run nuclear weapons program, and that some of his technology was about, perhaps, the separation of nuclear isotopes and the generation of nuclear material for a German atomic bomb, quite separate from the bomb that was stopped under the official German bomb program run by Heisenberg, which was cancelled, I think, in 1942. So at all times, the investigator in me that wants to see hard evidence is having to question whether what I'm seeing is about exotic let's call it propulsion and energy technology versus German secret nuclear technology. And for me, the jury is still very much out on that. But I don't think that makes it any the less interesting. It actually makes it equally mysterious that all of that stuff about a buried, hidden, but very extensive German nuclear weapons program from the Second World War, which has not really come to light. Some excellent research done by a guy called Todd Ryder in the States, who's looked at the German nuclear weapons program and documented it extensively, tells me one should keep an open mind about this stuff. But, again, it was the infrastructure around it all was so comprehensive and so effective that, what we're left with, in effect, is a sort of a very diffuse traces of whatever it was that was going on there. Right. And that, again, it speaks volumes to how effective Kammler was at keeping all of that stuff secret.
Right. Well, one of the interesting mysteries involved with this whole thing is, I think you reported what happened when the Americans first, after the war, after they attained victory, that when they first entered these areas, I know for sure you talked about it in the case of Victor Schauberger, and I think you also maybe mentioned it in terms of the Bell, where on both cases there seems to be clear that the American intelligence had foreknowledge of these programs, because I remember in the case of Voss, I think his name is, it was one of the German guys who was affiliated with Kammler, and he says that he went, he tried to be an informant and be like, hey, I'll trade secrets about this, and the American guys were like not interested, basically acting like they already knew, had the lay of the land in terms of what was going on here and what they wanted. And then Victor Schauberger, I think I remember you referencing the fact that he maybe wrote later on that he thought that there was number one, somebody interfering with his work kind of behind the scenes in Germany to kind of keep the progress from hitting a certain point before the war ended. And also it seemed like they knew exactly where he was and what he was working on, the American agents, and kind of sought him out like almost immediately after the war ended.
Well, now we know why, because at the time I was looking at it and writing about it back then, some of that stuff was quite opaque to me, in the sense that I did not know at that point, because I conjecture that all the evidence seemed to be pointing to the fact that, Kammler was a very resourceful individual, didn't seem like he was going to just, do himself in at the end of the war, or, find himself on the wrong side. And so at the end of the, towards the end of the book, I'm saying, I think this guy seems to have been veering towards doing a deal with the Americans, right, but I can't prove that. Like I say, now I can, or at least others have. Right. The documents are all there to show that he handed himself over and he surrendered to American forces, which explains why he was advanced American troops who had the knowledge given to them by Kammler, it appears, were able to go to all of those places where they knew these secret programs were going on, including Schauberger's stuff. Right. And then turning up on his doorstep isn't the mystery that it sort of appeared to have been then, in right. that Kammler or his subordinates merely directed them all to the Americans to where these programs were. And even the handover of Werner von Braun's rocket scientists to America, which looks sort of quite haphazard, at least, the way the history books tell it. It was quite a haphazard thing. Von Braun himself was largely behind, the handover. All of that looks pretty orchestrated as well, right, to me, through this lens that we now have, which is, Kammler handed himself over and was able to direct everyone to where all these secret projects are. But actually, you can go even further back, and see that there had been overtures opened up between America and Kammler's offices before the end of the war about how we hand this stuff over.
Mm-hmm.
We Germans, particularly from Kammler's staff, and there had been exchanges about that. So the handover of all of this knowledge was I think pretty orchestrated.
Right.
And of course, given that you're dealing with an extremely ruthless, lethal, and murderous organization, covering that up was a priority. You couldn't, just throw your hands up and go, yeah, well, we accepted all of this stuff, and we should be grateful and open about it because we've got the technology. Well, no, you couldn't be open about it because it came with a very heavy price, and that price was the level of suffering that came about through the whole Holocaust connection, which made it something that you would want to keep very deep, dark, and secret.
That angle, but also the idea that, to the extent that there were these very exotic technologies being harvested, that those form the basis of a new national security strategy, and that alone would justify the extensive cover up and need to keep this whole story untold for as long as possible. Right.
Well, I think the national security strategy was so heavily influenced by the emergence of nuclear power, nuclear
Right.
destructive power. In May 1945, of course, it was still a couple of months on from the detonation of the first atomic bomb in America. But the knowledge that this was going to be the shape of things, immediately after the war, that the world was going to be entering a nuclear age, certainly, to my mind anyway, shaped the national security infrastructure of, well, of course, not just America, but also of the Soviet Union and other emerging nuclear powers. But like I say, there's pretty strong evidence that the German nuclear program was much more extensive anyway than history relates it
Right.
to have.
It seems they had a working bomb. I mean, there's pretty.
Well, there is testimony to say that there have been tests of bombs. It's just that the footprint of those tests, if they took place, have long since gone or appear to have.
Right.
So again, you sort of, I need to be careful about what the evidence actually says. Right. But certainly, there is strong evidence, to my mind, of a deep infrastructure given over to nuclear weapons. And you mentioned Wilhelm Voss, who was sort of Kammler's alter ego administrator of the Kammler staff. Voss, by his own testimony, says that he was delivering plans for a German atomic bomb to the Americans when he was trying to hand himself over. And as you said, he was rebuffed in that those people said, forget it, we don't want to know. And why didn't they want to know? Because they had the plans already. Whatever Voss was going to tell them was redundant because Kammler had already handed them over, chances are. So, it's a fascinating, untold story, to my mind, of that part of the Second World War.
Right. So I'm curious. So after you published the book, you said you kind of moved on, got involved in different things. Have you had a steady stream of people contact you and want to talk more about the subject with you since then, or were you actually able to kind of put this to rest and not really deal with it for a long period until these more recent events took place?
Well, So the book came out. It generated a certain amount of interest. I mean, it did quite well commercially too at the time it came out. But I've sort of first and foremost. I mean, I went back to my job at Jane's Defense Weekly, and I did that for a few more years. It wasn't so interesting for me anymore. I think once you'd sort of been on that journey that I'd been, that led to the Hunt for Zero Point, my mind had been opened up to other things that I wanted to go off and do. So going back to my old job didn't quite have the appeal that it had before I set off on that journey. And then,
what was the reaction of your colleagues? Did they just pretend like it didn't exist?
No, overwhelmingly cynical. I mean, it was very much like, Cook's been drinking the Kool-Aid a little too deeply, and what is he writing about all of this stuff for? I mean, having said that, I had colleagues. I mean, I was very supported by my editors at Jane's Defense Weekly when I was researching and writing the book. I informed them of what I was doing. I didn't tell my colleagues because I was doing this stuff sort of, if you like, on the side. But I did tell my editors that I was doing it, and they were very supportive about it. But and I had another colleague I'd worked with extensively, a chap called Bill Sweetman, who'd done a lot of work on uncovering black programs with me, things like stealth and stealth fighters and what have you. He generously said that the Hunt for Zero Point should become a textbook for how you lead and for investigative journalism, in effect. And I like to think of it that way, in that it does follow a series of clues that take you to a kind of truth. And I mean, I don't derive a huge amount of satisfaction, but I do derive some satisfaction from the fact that we have in 2023 an investigation going on in Capitol Hill into the whole UFO UAP question, in which those politicians are clearly signaling that they think that there is a buried UAP program within the American defense infrastructure system, which, I didn't even go into that territory at all with the Hunt for Zero Point. That was quite separate to my mind from the investigation that I was doing. But, what my colleagues working in aerospace and defense sector journalism would have made of that at the time, I could only guess at. But, they certainly looked at me askance, as if I was, embarking on something really quite insane. And to me, in a way, it was, but I was compelled to do it. It was, once I'd been presented with those initial clues, there was no way that I could not follow them up. And that's,
I can relate to that. You kind of, there's a calling that all of a sudden comes to you, and you feel like you have no choice but to do the thing.
Absolutely no choice. I was on that path.
So just to wrap things up, I know that you've moved into, in recent years, becoming a novelist, and you also said that you've been more and more interested with fields of mind and consciousness. So let's start with the novelist. I've noticed that the themes seem to draw upon your background at Jane's Defense Weekly and in the sort of military technology world. What's your angle on getting into this field of creative writing? Are you trying to bring kind of your real world knowledge and kind of make it alive through a story, or what's your approach?
Well, what's not sort of general, well, why should anyone know this at all? But I was actually a novelist before I I wrote The Hunt for Zero Point. So I wrote 2 novels, 2 thrillers before I wrote The Hunt for Zero Point. And so I was able to bring a sort of certain thriller writing style to The Hunt. And that was deliberate, because this was a commercial book. It was bought commercially by a mainstream publisher, both in the UK and in the US. And, I knew it was pretty sort of inaccessible, as a subject matter to most people. So in order to make it accessible, I wanted to tell it narratively, so I describe things in the order that they came to me, but I wanted to do it in a way that sort of had page turnability about it. So there is deliberately that sort of thrillerish sort of aspect.
It does read very well. I mean, it pulls you right along.
Well, great. Well, thank you. That's nice to know. And it was deliberately done that way. So to employ the techniques that I'd previously learned as a thriller writer, and to sort of apply it to that nonfiction format. But what I also did as well, when I was at Jane's Defense Weekly, I ghostwrote. I wrote for other people. So if people had a story to tell, I would tell their story for them. And I have, not that I can talk about them too much, but I've had books in the bestseller list through the principals that I've written for. That I did a lot of that stuff as well. So, and I did that while I was a journalist, and then after I left Jane's too, I did some of that. And then I had this crazy idea shortly after leaving Jane's, that the sort of the aerospace and defense knowledge that I knew about from my 15 years at reporting on that industry could and should be applied to global challenges like climate change and food and water security and environmental degradation. So I worked with the defense industry for a while to try and get them to apply that knowledge to quote saving the planet.
As like a consultant.
I independently to begin with, but then I did actually work as a consultant to a few aerospace companies on that. And I brought together the chief technology officers of 8 of the 9 big aerospace and defense sector primes in Washington, D.C. with President Obama's science advisor, John Holdren, in 2011. And we talked about all of this, how do we save the planet? Or how do you save the planet? You aerospace and defense companies. And that was an interesting period in my life. And then I went back to thriller writing again, novel writing. So I wrote a novel called The Grid. I did some ghost writing as well. And then 2017 came along, when the New York Times wrote this UFO story about the buried ATIP program in the Pentagon investigating UFOs. And it sort of rekindled my interest in the stuff that I've been writing about when I was researching The Hunt for Zero Point. And I got in touch with some of those old sources and people who'd had sort of guided me on some aspects of the Hunt for Zero Point story. But in the meantime, actually, I'd become interested in consciousness because I'd witnessed a rather extraordinary event at the, strange as it may sound, or sort of dark as it may sound, it wasn't that at all. When my mother-in-law died, I was in the room, and my wife had this extraordinary experience where she felt she'd been taken part of the way with my mother-in-law when she died, in that she experienced a timeless, infinite, connected space that others have typically described when they've had a near-death experience.
Right.
Didn't know it at the time, but there is a thing called a shared death experience, which imbue in which some of the qualities of a near-death experience are imbued into the individual who's sharing in that experience. This is where the sort of curious investigator part of me kicked in, because I was so intrigued by what had happened to her that I went off and researched the whole consciousness thing, a little bit like I'd been led down a path when that anti-gravity article landed on my desk at Jane's Defense Weekly, and that led me down that road. Well, this led me down a consciousness path. And
With the
ultimately,
idea of doing a book on the topic?
no, not at all. I was just researching it because I was initially not. After a bit, I amassed so much knowledge, or at least I became so immersed in the subject area that I felt I was able to write a book about it. But I couldn't write a non-fiction book about it because I wasn't qualified to. I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist. Right. So instead, I wrote a thriller about it, which is The Grid.
Okay.
But then I continued to be intrigued by it. I ended up actually entering an essay competition, which had been set in place by Robert Bigelow's sort of nascent consciousness institute called BICS, the Bigelow Institute of Consciousness Studies. And that was a $2 million prize attached to that contest. And I ended up being one of the winners of that contest, to my extraordinary surprise. And what that has given me, and actually then Robert Bigelow offered me a research director's post in the Institute. So I've sort of maintained this consciousness connection since, and become extremely interested in it. And that's sort of still guiding some of my interests and work today. So yeah, that's where I am now.
So what do you have on the horizon in terms of your involvement with that institute? And are you working towards a goal? Are you working towards on a project that's...
Well, no, I mean, Robert Bigelow himself has his own goals and sort of aims associated with his own institute. And I'm, only along with 8 other directors are sort of indirectly involved in that. I've got my own ideas about, sort of setting up something that is about consciousness, it merges some of those earlier themes where I had been working with the aerospace and defense sector in seeing how we can, why are we stuck in certain paradigms of thought and thinking? Maybe there are ways that we can trigger new ways of thinking in people in society to make us look at challenges in the world in a different way. Mm-hmm. So I'm a little involved in thinking that one through at the moment. I'm still writing a lot. So yeah, I keep pretty busy, what with one thing and another.
Do you have any ambitions to have any of these books that you've written turned into screenplays or made into a theatrical?
I first and foremost, my sort of storytelling my love of storytelling is mostly associated with films. I'm not a screenwriter. I don't write film scripts, but I love the movies as a thing. Mm-hmm. So I've always sort of seen things quite sort of filmically, and of course I would love for some of the things that I've created to be turned into films. I mean, I had a lot of film interest over the years in the Hunt for Zero Point, and it would be great if someone one day took the ideas expressed in the book and made them their own. I'd be delighted to see that happen, and also some of the other stuff I've done. So yeah, I'd be very open to that idea.
So who would you have play you?
Well, I don't know. I haven't quite got that far. I certainly know who, I think there are various candidates out there that my wife would like to see actors play me, but I don't think that's very realistic. So I don't know. I only got as far as thinking through how I would try and tell the story filmically were I to be involved in the project. And I certainly have some ideas about that.
I think it can definitely work as a movie, for sure.
Well, thank you. I think it would. Funnily enough, there's been renewed interest in it since the whole UFO resurgence over the last 5 years or so. More people have come to the book. I'd say, in a way, more people have come to the book in the last 5 years than they certainly did in its first 5 years.
Right.
And there were those wilderness years in between when, I never really discussed it at all.
Right.
So yeah, who knows? Somebody may read it, pick it up, and go, yeah, this is a Spielberg movie. Who knows?
Well, it was great talking to you, Nick. I really enjoyed this.
Well, me too, Alex. And thank you. I've really enjoyed almost 2 hours have flown. So thank you for your, very in-depth questions. And it certainly made me think about the book again in a whole new light. So I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Hopefully we can stay in touch. And yeah, good luck with everything.
Thank you very much indeed.
All right, take care.
Are we done? Out?
Yeah,
Finished?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Listen, thanks again. I really enjoyed it. Take care, and we'll stay in touch.
All right, cheers.
Cheers. Bye.